Welcome everyone to this first Rhodes event of the season. I'm sure that being the fall semester, you're like me, your hair's on fire and your head's exploding. So thank you for taking the time to basically come out and do something a little bit different at lunchtime. The curry helps, but I never regard it as a sufficient bribe. So it must be something to do with the content. In that regard, I'm delighted to welcome back to Brown Professor Josh Preiss, who spent some time here in, was it 16, 17?
Yep.
Yeah, 16, 17, to discuss his work, Just Work for All, the American Dream in the 21st Century. Josh is a professor of philosophy and director of the program Philosophy and Politics and Economics at Minnesota State University, Mankato. A couple of words from introduction, I'll just pass to Josh. We ended last semester, if you came along, with a conversation with our colleague from economics, Oded Gador, on his book, The Journey of Humanity, which is this very, very refreshingly optimistic take on basically the prospects for the future of us, despite all the gloom and doom. And it was great to end with that, but it's very macro. And the problem with these macro long-run stories is they're always right until they're exactly wrong, which you can never tell from what's in the data set behind. And then the second problem with them is nobody lives on a long-run average. Everybody lives in a historical moment. So if that historical moment might be far better than it was during Engels' pause, the second Engels' pause we're living through now might be way better than the first one, but it's still not ideal for the people constituting it. In that regard, the philosopher's perspective is a great one to start with, because ultimately we don't argue about politics and economics just over the means. We should talk about the ends. And if the end is ultimately what does it mean to have an American dream and the idea of just work, we need to be very clear what we're talking about and what are the possibilities for its actualization. So with that, I will pass over to Josh, who will do the hard bit of filling in all those things I just laid out.
See, you got my clicker here. Thanks so much for that introduction. Do I sound good to everybody? Yeah? Okay. Thanks so much for that introduction. I tend to walk around here, so I got to get a sense of where the light is. Thanks, Mark, for the invitation, the introduction. Thank you, everyone, for coming in person, and everyone who is watching the live stream. I appreciate it. Send me an email if you have any questions. Send me an email if you have any concerns, but if you particularly send me an email if you have compliments, because I'd be happy to read them. Okay, so that's me. I'm going to go through the talk. I'll talk about 30, 35 minutes. I won't try and give you everything I argue in the book, because that would be a fool's errand and nothing would be taken home. But here's what we are going to talk about. The book, in a way, it has two main distinctions. One is two different models of society, which I call a Smithian well-ordered society and a winner-take-all society. And I say model here, I don't necessarily mean normative, but I use these categories in order to capture a number of different trends taking place, and I focus on the United States, as the book says, but a number of trends which certainly have corollaries in most wealthy democratic countries in the world. I use these models to kind of talk about these trends, and then with these trends in mind, I break down what is sometimes referred to as the American dream in terms of two fundamental normative principles that I argue in the book, and I won't defend this claim here, but I make a number of arguments about why they fit, both historically and in contemporary American politics. So a lot of the work looks at state-of-the-art work in sociology and political science on what people actually care about, particularly with respect to inequality in markets. So you're going to look at these two different sort of principles that are part of American public philosophy of markets, are represented in the American dream, but yet nonetheless are distinct. I'm going to talk about the methodology, and then with those principles in mind, I'm going to say what the American dream, what it should be focused on, and how to make that more close to a reality, or how to make society comparatively just when some of the trends are taking us further from SWO to WTA. Talk a bit about the impact of COVID, and then a little bit about the future of work, and make some general comments. Okay. So, a lot of stuff here. I'm not going to read the slide. But again, the idea of a Smithian well-ordered society, it's not meant as an ideal model of an ideally just society. So I'm not saying a well-ordered society is like just the way society should be. I'm also not saying that it's just the way that Smith thinks it should be. Rather, Smith is a kind of role model, exemplar, inspiration for a couple aspects of SWO. Specifically, I take a central current in Smith's, the normative justification for markets for Smith is the elevation of the working poor, right? And one of the virtues of markets is not just that they're more efficient, but that they liberally reward market-specific virtues, in particular industry and prudence. Right, okay. So with that sort of inspiration in mind, and as you probably, if you've read the book, or you probably can already tell, what I'm describing in the United States context is now in some ways, well-trodden trends from mid-century post-World War II economy through the last 50-year economy, right? And I talk about the ways in which, so again, with this model in mind, it's meant to capture some of those trends. It also fits with American public philosophy in certain ways. But the take-home here is that a Smithian well-ordered society, one of the characteristics is that growth is not equitable, not in the sense that there is equality throughout society, far from it, but in the sense that there are broad-based gains to income, leisure, and security and status. So you have a high-growth society where workers in general are doing better. Right? And I talk about reasons why that is and is not the case in certain contexts, but we won't go into that for right now. And then I use this, if I'm using this oft-mentioned EPI slide, which is perhaps misinterpreted at least as often as it's cited, and for a variety of reasons, both by people who are, well, on different sides of debates. We'll just
If you're going to open that up, say why it's misinterpreted.
Okay, good. And I appreciate not waiting till the end for questions and just jumping right in. Well, I think sometimes people will use it, for example, from a certain left perspective, they will use it as a way of showing how capitalists or those who control capital are getting more and more of the share of the fruits of economic growth. Now, that's an element of that, but a big drive, there's a couple of different drivers here that aren't really captured in that, maybe even more so captured in that. One is the rapid rise of healthcare costs, is a share of compensation, right? So one of the reasons why wages have not kept up is because healthcare is so expensive, right? And they've kind of crowded out that. There's also this, I guess you would say, this Marxist lens of capitalist and worker, as Branko Milanovic and others have talked about, doesn't fit the contemporary economy particularly neatly. Most of the high earners, most of the big take-home wealthy people are also workers. They also get paid in what on the Marxist perspective is labor, right? So a lot of what's going on here is not capital, taking a larger share, but rather inequalities between workers. Now, there's a way of understanding those inequalities in terms of a capital framework, right? Like human capital or digital capital or whatever. But sometimes people make it to mean one thing or another. So you have a certain set of criticism then which will kind of miss the point, and we'll come back and say, well, no, it's just because they're paying their people more healthcare costs. And Angus Deaton and Ann Case had a nice response to that I quoted in the book, which is that we shouldn't pretend that rapidly rising healthcare costs are somehow a boon to worker to compensate them for the loss. But anyway, those are some things.
Another interjection. How you define productivity?
How do I define productivity? Okay. I might not get past this slide if I'm careful. Okay, well, how does this slide define productivity? I don't really want to defend the EPI slide necessarily, but I did put it up there.
Right, but let's not get hung up on this because this is just a slide that he's using for illustrative
Right.
purposes. Let's look
And to be honest, to be frank, I didn't refresh my memory of the specifics of the slide at the same time as I prepared it, so perhaps I shouldn't have.
Gap, you see, and
Right.
the method's your gap, right?
Right.
So how you define
Right,
It's
but-
not his gap.
But it's not my gap, yeah.
Please
Okay,
let
sorry.
him get on to the top.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and talk a little bit further. I think you'll see how it does and does not fit in, and perhaps I should have chosen a different slide in this
I
context.
shouldn't have asked.
But in any event. So how you define productivity, okay, I'm not going to get involved in various debates of productivity. I mean, the cop-out answer would also be that you can look at the book and see whatever, but you have a number of different trends in the United States, we'll just say, focus on, and a lot of different explanations for rising inequality, for example, or for a gap, which I think is fairly well established, but we could, I suppose, in question and answer, get into that if you like. You have a number of different things going on, a number of different explanations as to why it's going on. But just for the purposes of this talk, we can say I'd focus on one. You have lower absolute mobility, right? So you can look at Raj Chetty and other people's work on that. You have rising inequality on a number of different measures, And you have lots of explanations for that, from labor market polarization and so on. One explanation, which is sort of the inspiration for the title, but can be a little misleading when I say a winner-take-all society, one explanation is winner-take-all or superstar networks. Superstar markets, that is, markets where small differences in talent, education, and luck lead to giant differences in reward. Okay, so you have these trends. You can, I guess, argue with me as to whether or not society is increasingly moving from a more equitable, rapid growth society to one with slower growth and where the fruits of that growth are more concentrated. I think I could win that argument, but I suppose we could do that. But grant me then for the next 20 minutes that that is what's going on. Okay, so we have that distinction. Then we have a distinction between two different normative principles. Principles of justice that are widely recognized in American public philosophy of markets. On the bottom here, I have some quotes. More time allowed, I might ask you to guess who are these quotes. But the first principle of the American dream, and often what people think of when they think of the American dream, is this idea of a fair race. That is a meritocratic principle in the language of philosophy, right? Whereas inequalities tend to reflect, well, sort of a more extreme version here. Justice is a level playing field where rewards are proportionate to merit and effort. And that's actually Paul Ryan who said that particular one, because he was calling Obama a socialist, so he called Paul. So he said, this is what we believe in. Which actually sounds very similar to Rawls's fair equality of opportunity, which is right there. In any event, so you have this principle which says, like, look, what really matters is that the game is basically fair, or fair enough, kind of a level playing field. Right. Widely adopted American public philosophy has a lot of traction in both politics. There's a reason why Paul Ryan thinks it's a good thing to quote it, even if he doesn't believe it, or even if one might argue his policies, preferences don't reflect it. He thinks it has currency. Right. We contrast this level playing field. This would be an example of an unlevel playing field, in a certain sense. We can contrast this with a second principle, just work. Just work is not concerned fundamentally, or even at all really, with a level playing field, although a level playing field is relative to relational justice, and we can talk about why I think that if you want. But it's a relational principle of justice in the sense that people, well, I'll just, you can read the thing, but it reflects the dignity of work and the status of those who perform it, including the widely held conviction that we should be able to exchange, people should be able to exchange hard work for a middle-class life for themselves and their family. Now, middle class here is not a statistical measure, like middle income. It's a normative concept, right? When people use the term middle class, I think generally in American public philosophy, they don't mean income around the middle. They mean a certain set of things. One of those things is a share of the fruits of economic growth, right? I mean, as far back as at least Smith, most thoughtful economists, most thoughtful political economists recognize that thinking of these things is in some sense fundamentally relational, right? How you define welfare and wealth is not just a statistical measure, it's who you compare yourself to. But also includes concerns for domination in the workplace, other things I talk about in different parts of my work on freedom and markets, right? And we have here quotes from, as the picture connotes probably, signals to you, Martin Luther King. Other than Smith, probably maybe even more so than Smith, Martin Luther King is sort of the animating force behind my conception of just work and the role it plays in the American economy. Again, not in an appeal authority sense. I don't say what King or Smith says about justice is what justice is, but there's a lot of discussion of King in there. Right. So you have these two principles, which I've maybe or maybe not explained well in the last 3-4 minutes. And you have this changing context, right? You have a context where you're getting slower growth, where the fruits of economic growth are more concentrated. In some ways, diminishing power, in some cases, less insecurity by certain measures, right? You have these trends. You have these two principles of justice, both of which have widespread public currency, right? They're reflected in foundational documents. They're reflected in important thinkers and political leaders. They're reflected in the social sciences of what people actually care about, right? So where do we go from here? Well, a standard philosophical approach then would be to say, okay, well, we have two principles. What should we do? Well, okay, one thing we can do is take one principle as what justice just is, and then see if you get any counterexamples, right? things it doesn't capture or things that it seems to give you the wrong answer on, right? And then maybe do it with the other principle. Another approach would be to see how they fit together in something like an ideally just society, right? So how would you trade them off in something like an ideally just society? You know, okay, so if we got society just as we could, let's assume whatever, that we could, right? Let's assume that we think that one of the purposes of political philosophy is to provide a target or a goal or a model to aim for. And by that we mean something like the best version of society that's actually achievable given the kind of humans we are and the place we are, right? Right. How would these trade off with each other? Right? Those are two standard philosophical ways of addressing these two very distinct principles, right? I don't do either of those things. I think that they are useful things to do. I think that the process of doing them can often be really informative, including about what these principles might mean and what we really do think when we say things, right? Thinking about these principles. But my approach, what I call here in the book and elsewhere, is normative. I call it normative political economy or integrated PPE, philosophy, politics, and economics, right? That is, I say, okay, rather than say which of these principles is the truth about justice or what an ideally just society would be and how we would balance these principles off, I look at what these principles mean in that context and also say certain things about which, well, to kind of cut to the chase and then I'll come back to the details. As societies move from SWO to W2A, just work becomes far more important. The politics and policy of just work become far more important, and I'll explain what I mean by important in a bit, right? So what makes it integrated is I say the question is not, or my approach is not fundamentally what the truth about justice is, right? And then we use the social science to figure out how to get there. But instead we use the social science, including the economics, to figure out which principles matter more and why, and about what sorts of politics and policy would be feasible ways to make society comparatively just according to these two principles. Right, so you might call it a more contextual. Sometimes I talk about it that way. Okay, so rather than talking broadly about the methodology, let's actually do what I do in the book, which is put these two principles to the test. Okay, so in SWO, in a broadly Smithian well-ordered society, in the sense in which fruits of economic growth lead to widespread gains up and down the income ladder or whatever. How that income is just a cursory, right? When I'm talking about justice, I don't just mean income, but it's an easy shorthand for talking about a certain kind of inequality, right? It makes much more sense to talk about fair race, right? For those who are concerned with the American dream or those concerned about justice. Because after all, a Smithian well-ordered society can be radically unjust from the perspective of fair race. And indeed, the mid-century American economy was just that, right? It was colossally, epically, oppressively unjust, right? So chapter 4, and I talk about a couple different senses. Chapter 4 and 5, I talk about race and gender, or sex, depending on how you want to break down that distinction in the 50s versus in 2020 theory. But so it makes sense for those concerned about the American dream, concerned about justice, to adopt a politics and a policy that ameliorates these tremendous inequalities of opportunity from the perspective of fair race. But as society looks more and more like WTA and less like SWO, right, the politics and policy of fair race don't really get the job done anymore. Not only do they not get the job done, but I don't mean get the job done in the sense that they don't secure just work, which people also care about. And I think people really care more about, actually. Cards on the table. But they don't even help, they don't do very well even on their own terms. The economics of winner-take-all societies militate against the politics of fair race. As the fruits of economic growth are increasingly concentrated, right, it makes sense that people would go to greater and greater lengths to hoard opportunities for themselves and their kids. Right? In a Smithian well-ordered society, right, a better life for my children isn't going to depend upon rigging the game in their favor. It might depend on that the more WTA a society gets. Right? Not only that, it encourages the politics and policy of fair race, encourages a zero-sum thinking about justice. So my chapter on race, in a way, foreshadows much larger and more dedicated to this topic book by Heather McGee recently, The Sum of Us, which talks about the dangers of zero-sum thinking and racial justice politics. Right? I'm saying sort of basically the same thing, right? The politics of fair race often can get in the way of making progress, even towards fair race in some ways. Or to put it, actually, that's not really what I mean. It needs to be buttressed by, supplanted by, focused on a politics of just work.
I'm sorry. I'm a little clear as to why it is that the politics of fair race encourages the zero-sum thinking.
Well, okay. So just to, and I'll move to, maybe it'll make more sense as I continue to talk about it. But one way to, well, okay, put it this way. The politics of fair race can encourage zero-sum thinking in general, in the sense that you say that the fundamental problem is not that people in general are doing better, or that workers in general are better off if they're willing to put in work, or that middle-class life is generally available, but rather that certain sorts of people have opportunities and other people comparatively don't. Or, again, how does it encourage, did you say? Or did you say, yeah. Okay.
Just asking how.
Yeah. Well, okay, so I think perhaps lurking in your question is not so much. So you might say it's not essentially part of the politics of fair race, right? You don't need to see the world as a zero-sum game to be concerned about fair race. In fact, one should be concerned about fair race. People who are concerned about justice should be concerned about fair race, right? So maybe encourages is actually not exactly the right word. It doesn't combat and or goes along with and or, right? The best way to talk about it would be to do something which I'm not sure I want to do in this context right now, which is to talk about different political movements and how they could or could not, how they do and do not talk about zero-sum thinking. But I guess I feel it's, for me it's, yeah. Okay, well, so you might have,
Give an example in the book with Richard Reeves' work, Dream Hoarders.
right.
Right, essentially, if you have nominally the same access, everybody can go to Brown. Well, in that case, why is a third of our population drawn from the top 1%?
Right. But also, I think within the concept of racial and gender justice, right, you can sometimes have a, first of all, there can be a kind of, let's put it this way. If you focus on fair race without attending to just work, right, you're going, okay, sorry, it's a good question, as you can tell, and a question I wasn't quite prepared for in this case. But so here are two things I have in mind. One is debates about racial justice, where one might see, most of these things, most individual theorists is complex enough to encode that. But one of the criticisms that, say, some of the people that I cite in the book, including Reed and Alexander and others, is this tendency to think that justice is not like, for example, racial justice is only a problem. The fundamental problem is a lack of equal access, right? So there would be nothing particularly wrong or unjust about a society where you had a broadly winner-take-all society, but one where African Americans and white Americans had more or less the same shot to attain relative positions of power and privilege, right? Contrast that with a politics which says, no, the fundamental problem here is that workers are not sufficiently empowered, not getting a larger share, right? And so the best way of approaching that is not going to try to get greater representation among the elites, among racial and gender minorities or traditionally oppressed people, but instead to include broad-based gains, right? It's a different focus, right? So it's not, so maybe a better way of putting it that encourages, particularly a better way of putting it from the perspective of what I can do on a slide versus what I can do in a book, would be to say, like, it misses a big part of the picture in a way that can be self-defeating. Does that make more sense? Right. So that's probably better than encourages. However, I do think that if you can have, there can be this, including with respect to the American dream, a kind of myopic fair race focus. That one is just doesn't get the complexity of the concept of the American dream, doesn't get the complexity of, doesn't really focus on what people care about, including people who have less equal opportunity, let's just say. Well, so anyway, I'll do that. But that's a good criticism, and I think I should probably revise that slide. Or come up with a better answer. But also, the politics and policy of fair race doesn't really get at a lot of the important sort of what I would call moral harms of winner-take-all societies. I got a laundry list of stuff here. Don't need to talk about all of them independently. But I'm going to focus on the two. So we've got this that I've put in bold. One is this idea of deaths of despair, right, which people in this room are probably fairly well familiar with. Anne Case and Agnes Deaton's sort of work on the rapid rise in suicide and death by drug use among particularly, well, their focus is on parts of the country, regions where, from a certain perspective, good jobs have left. They talk about it as the ongoing decline, the multi-generational decline. A Smithian way to put about it is, in terms of a Smithian wall or society, people who have less and less hope for a better future, not just for themselves, but for their kids. Right. So you have these dying communities, you have these rapid rises of deaths of despair. You have all sorts of other things that people who work in political economy think are broadly related to the economics of WTA. But one thing worth noting is that, and this is something that Smith could tell you about, and certainly Smithians should tell you about, which is that winner-take-all societies tend to make us worse people. In a society where people have less of a faith that their hard work will lead to a better life for themselves and their children, right? In a society where wealth capture or rent taking plays a larger role than production, right, or productive energies, people are generally going to be worse people. They're going to be worse to whoever they can be told to blame for it. They generally tend to be less tolerant. They tend to be less supportive of liberal democratic institutions. Right, and again, you can take a look at the book for the various citations on this. I think this trend it plays a role in the rise of authoritarian populism, both left and right, although perhaps the right is more troubling depending on the context. But we'll get another example of that in the Italian election coming up here. But see how that goes. But and also in terms of personal responsibility. So one of my maybe worth, because it's a little bit of an insight here, and I also see a little bit of my audience. So one of the spheres of my research focuses on the use of personal responsibility, both in moral philosophy, but also in the politics of inequality in the American context, right? Right. And a lot of that work, just to try and be very brief about it, tends to have a kind of negation or nullification strategy way of approaching it. So, right, so you might have, on the left, you might have a certain strategy that say, like, look, here's what people are and are not responsible for, right? And look at all the things they're not responsible for. Look at how that tracks inequality. Therefore, personal responsibility doesn't matter. Inequalities aren't deserved, and therefore, maybe on a radical version, therefore social, or something like that, right? There's a problem with that, I argue in the book, but there's also a problem with taking the other side, not just with policies like any. I have this series of works on what I call libertarian personal responsibility, right? In order for responsibility to be meaningful to people, right, they have to see their success or failure as being in some ways connected to the fruits of their efforts. And the more in which they see, rightly or wrongly, in some cases rightly, that a middle-class life is not available to them if they're willing to work hard, the less we should expect them to work hard. I mean, I think Smith has this sort of famous quote, like the reward of man, I'm butchering stuff today. The labor industry is there basically proportional to its reward, right? Now, one could interpret that in kind of like a purchasing power parity in sense and say, like, workers today are getting so much more rewarded than 250 years ago or something like that, right? Or they can be more contextual, right? They can be more about hope for a future, right? So if you want people to take personal responsibility for their actions, the best way to do it is not to deny, so a lot of this discourse is like, well, he was lazy, she was lazy, therefore they shouldn't get welfare benefits or something like that. Rather, you should take policies and politics that make it more likely for just work to be realized. And in those contexts, it makes sense for people to be more industrious. right? Right, so our motivations, our values are not fixed. They evolve according to the political and economic context. Okay. So I have these distinctions, these trends in American political economy, and I have these values then that I think are part and parcel to the American dream, which of course is not to say that everyone affirms both values or anything like that. Okay. So what would the policy of just work look like in a WTA context? And there's a lot of stuff piled up there on that slide. Each individual one might be controversial for one reason or another. Each individual one has a giant discourse and literature behind it, right? And it may represent somebody in this room favorite pet literature or discourse, right? I'm happy to talk about it and maybe seem ignorant, and that's fine. I'm going to focus on two things that I talk about in the book, but I'm happy to talk about any of these other ones. One, I tend to favor something like a jobs guarantee over something like, for example, it's become a pet literature, basic income. I have a number of friends who are really important in the philosophical literature on basic income. I've published in basic income studies. I think that there are ways in which basic income can address certain sorts of ways of defending the market, including buttressing certain sorts of claims that people make about freedom in the market that don't hold up very well without it. All that being said, I don't think the politics of basic income, particularly in the American context, are very good. I don't think it gets at just work as well. Jobs guarantee does much better, in part because one of the central ways, I think, if you would say, the political economy of just work, right? One of the central ways to get there is to make the labor market as tight and competitive as possible. And so a jobs guarantee can play a role in doing that. Publicly funded childcare and early childhood education, right? So why do I advocate that as just work? Well, one way of thinking about just work is to address what remains of our gender division of labor, right? So we have, a fair amount, and so chapter 5 of the book focuses on gender inequality, right? And so, broadly accessible childcare addresses what remains of our gender division of labor. It also better addresses than some other policies some of the inequalities that result from that, but also it serves just work in a number of different ways. For example, a huge percentage of the people who work hard and diligently and provide goods that people, that King would say, have the human dignity of their labor is there, get paid very, very little. Any policy that raises the wages and demand for these workers is generally going to be a pro-just work policy. Right? Publicly provided education also enables people to stay in certain careers and continue to advance to more close to a middle-class life. A central issue with the decline of just work in the American context, part of it is a very regionalized growth model. And one thing that, in the sense that like you have a lot of communities where there aren't good jobs, one thing that makes it harder for people to move communities, right? And my argument here is not that people should be expected to leave their community in order to have a good job, right? But one of the things that makes it very hard for them to do so is that they're leaving behind caregivers, extended family, those who might care for children, right? Accessibility of publicly funded childcare provides much easier way for people to search and form and to move to areas with better employment, right? And there's a variety of other reasons why. So those are some of the policies. So what impact COVID? So when I was writing the book, COVID happened. And COVID seemed to, at least at first, and this is how I'll end the talk, and we'll go on to some more questions, or resume some of the other questions. It seemed to be winner take all on steroids. You seem to have, for example, people were more greatly impacted, where a lot of the people who were already by various measures doing worse, or so on, or who were less able to achieve just work. you had a threat of debt and insecurity, further concentrations of power, so on and so forth, and provide incentives for labor replacing technology. If you want to take a kind of like, I did when the pandemic came on, I did a pandemic ethics podcast series. Had Daron Acemoglu on. We talked about you know, the ways in which this might sort of jumpstart certain sorts of trends in technology and the role that might have on inequality and the bargaining power of labor. Right. But it didn't really exactly go like that. At this point, African Americans are less likely to die of COVID than white Americans. A lot of the inequalities that resulted early in the pandemic don't really there. And you've actually got Aaron Dubé and David Autor just gave a talk last week at Harvard. I know I didn't go there because I live in Minnesota, not in Harvard. But this, in fact, we saw very much, in some ways, the opposite. The wages of lower wage workers are getting a larger, for the first time in decades, a larger share of the fruits of economic growth. In other words, the policy of the pandemic combined with demographics, right? You had a whole bunch of people retiring early, you have an aging population already, led to a really tight labor market in some senses of the term, right? This helped a little bit. So the question, and this is not the question I want to end on to discuss, but one question one would need to address is this sustainable? Right? Or is it because of the way it's coming up now, and because it's coming up with inflation that is partly due to that, perhaps largely not due to that, but I won't pretend to be a monetary theorist here. I shouldn't pretend to be that probably right now. I'm pretending that. But you have central banks throughout the world trying to deal with this inflation with the instrument that they have, right? And that instrument might very well crack the labor power that's just starting to generate. And whether that's good or bad is actually a different question. But how much of this is sustainable in this context? And particularly, how much of it is sustainable in a context where stuff like this hasn't happened? And this is why in the book what I defend is not a redistributive policy per se, or at least is the way it's sometimes used in economics or philosophy, but rather a productive policy, a way to encourage more productivity in certain contexts and to do it in a labor-friendly way, right? Because inflation is, after all, the relationship between supply and demand, right? And one way to address inflation is to increase supply, or increase supply in a way that is less subject to certain sort of supply chain threats. Anyway, if you want to know more, here are some places to know more. If you go to Routledge to buy the book, here's a code for you to get 30% off, which brings it into the realm of reasonable price level of $30. And there's some other places. Okay, that's it. Questions? More questions?
I'll let you field your own questions.
Yeah, and I went 3 minutes long just because I already started the question and answer period in advance. So, yes, please, David.
So, really fascinating project. I'm excited I'm going to read the book soon. I'm sort of convinced by the moral harms of the winner-take-all economy that we now have. And I guess I was curious, do you think it's uniformly a negative? And so in what ways, are there positive aspects of the winner-take-all economy? So my understanding from the Cook and Frank book is that winner-take-all markets exist now primarily because of dramatic drops in transportation and tariff costs, revolutions in information computing and technology, and English as a de facto world language. And at least two of those seem to have a lot of benefits. So how do you sort of weigh out the underlying causes of winner-take-all markets that maybe are beneficial versus the moral harms or maybe the outcomes of those things?
That's a perfect question. I mean, very carefully. No, but I think, look, I guess one, I don't know how many people this would be an accurate story of, but my story of the rise of particularly winner-take-all markets in particular, but also even WTA society in general, is not necessarily or primarily, a bunch of the picture of the Monopoly character, twilting his mustache and coming up with ideas to capture all of the wealth or something like that. Like a lot of the reasons why we got to this place were reasons that either were policies or things that were adopted that seemed to make sense to good people proceeding in good faith, but didn't go the way they wanted, or maybe even just have straightforward benefits and cheaper good, for example. if you're going to do a contextual work in political theory, and if your goal is, or you know, an integrated PPE, and your goal is to make to a comparatively just society, for each of these things, you have to look at each concrete case, at each concrete policy, and to trade off. So like when in chapter 6, I talk about the methodology, right? There can be this debate within philosophy, like, okay, now that we have all these different principles, one way of resolving the tension between different principles of justice is, I mean, Rawls's way, he's got two main, John Rawls, right, the political philosopher, right? You know, we got two main principles of justice on this, well, really kind of three, but two main principles of justice, right? And he starts to label one as having lexical priority over another, and then another to have priority over another. I think that's mistaken for a variety of reasons, right? But even if just work is like a fundamental crisis to American political economy, even if addressing just work is crucial in order to perhaps even save liberal democratic institutions, if you want to go that far, maybe. It still doesn't mean that any step forward in just work is a better society, right? You always have to consider the trade-offs of each of those step forwards. Does that make sense? What you need to do, though, is to recognize that in some cases, making things less well functioning from other principles, including perhaps efficiency, maybe even purchasing power parity, well, for a variety of other principles that we might also think are good, it might be compelling upon us, if I'm right, about the role that a winner-take-all society can have in our Constitution as individuals, our moral character, our sense of justice, and so on. We might need to trade off some of those other values for just work at the same time. You can't provide, you know, so I say in the book, I'm not going to quote myself because I haven't read that section in a year now, year and a half. But, you know, I say something like, look, it doesn't mean just work, because even if just work is the most compelling principle we need to think about if we're concerned with the American dream right now, doesn't mean we should sacrifice fair race for just work in every case, for example, or even in most cases, right? It means we need to tackle just work if we want these other things to happen. Does that make sense? In a way, it's a cop-out, but in a way, I think that's the only, like, reasonable, rational, sophisticated answer to that kind of a question. Yeah. So what would be more interesting, perhaps, is if you were like, well, is to go case by case, policy by policy, you know, what would you do? And I do that a little bit of that in the book. Yeah.
Yeah, earlier on, I brought up, you know, the question about how you define the productivities. And in many sense, I think, you know, what's the media or government talk of increased productivity could be a delusion. And for instance, you know, I'm in the field of healthcare. In fact, I'm a heart surgeon. Okay. And if you look at the medicine, you know, the healthcare, have we really increased productivity that much, you know, over the last decade or century? And its contribution.
Yeah.
Because most what we gain in medicine, in surgery, okay, we're able to prolong the terminal disease. And if people survive longer, in fact today, you cannot die, honestly. And I can put your ECMO heart lung machine, you know, needle-lysis, you know, most people today in are still succumb to infection. Yeah. But you can live forever, essentially. So productivity, to me, has to be defined.
Yeah.
That the benefit of productivity is not to restrict a very minority population, but benefit society overall. But if you look at quality of the healthcare in the United States, we're not getting better.
Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, lifespan is coming down.
Right.
So I'm not so sure we really increase productivities, right? It's a delusion. You know, it's a lie.
That gives me more insight to your question. So, like, I'm not when I'm citing this, EPI is defining productivity in one way. I am certainly not making a normative claim about that this is how we should understand productivity. In fact, I would probably say something very, very different, right? I mean, so depending on which context, so I have a series of papers on financial markets and financial market regulation, where I say freedom should be one of the components of a cost-benefit analysis of financial market regulation, right? And so what I'm implying there is that the cost-benefit analysis that's done in considering financial regulations is morally limited, right? And so I'm certainly not going to come up here and say the EPI's got what the good life is and that they've measured it, and these people are getting a lot more of it, and these people are getting
how we officially, you know, define productivity.
Right, right. So this is just meant to be a graph that points to by one measure of productivity, one that has its virtues, you know, this is being done. And then, like, you know, I mean, fundamentally, what I'm arguing in the book, of course, is that, you know, when we want to think about not just justice, but really just what it means to be well off, right? Yeah, we have to think of that relationally, and there's normative principles involved. And so I'm kind of like really on board with your what I take to be your source of criticism here. But then you'd have to go.
I'm not criticizing you. I just think.
Oh no, of the
we're
graph.
very misinformed.
Yeah.
By the government, by the media. You know.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, in healthcare, of course. I mean, what was this? Like 20 years ago, what was the famous quote? Like, it's the price is stupid. You know, you spend more on it, and it's because.
Criticism at all. I just say, you know, a lot of time we take for granted what to be true is not true. Yeah.
Well, it's not that it's not true, it's not that people are lying, it's very limited. If you're measuring output per worker, if you're making cars, you can count the cars. If you're doing healthcare, you can count the patients, but it's a very misleading way of thinking about the output of the healthcare system.
Yeah.
So it's not as lying, it's not also integral to his argument. I mean, essentially we're simply saying, you know, in order to have a growing society whereby you share in the benefits of economic growth, you kind of have to have economic growth. And however you measure it, then basically productivity becomes one of the lodestones. Tony.
And
Tony.
Oh, sorry, Tony, please.
It's sort of related, but it goes back to your list of things that you would lean on. And one of them that isn't there might be, you know, universal health care in a sense. Is that a component?
Yeah.
Of what you have to do, given we spend, you know, 16% of the GDP
Yeah,
on
I think
health,
absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, and get bookers for it, but I'm also interested in, so this list to me is kind of funny in terms of what the priorities are. You know, I might have expected to see universal health care up there.
Yeah.
As a thing, and I'm not quite sure, I'd be interested, I can imagine why, but I'd like to hear what you have to say about why limiting tax competition made it onto the top of the
Absolutely.
list of things that you think ought to be done.
Perfect. First, I want to say, so the people I'm looking at when I'm using growth from an economic perspective, what I'm more talking about, economic-y way of thinking about growth in the book are Robert Gordon, is his work, for example. So I look at often. So one measure would be, you know, I'm not going to, in part because I'm not particularly qualified, in part because if I went and read more about it for another week, then I'd have a more interesting discussion. But you know, I'm a PPE scholar who hasn't written this particular book in 2 years now, right? So like my freshness of that discourse is there. But you could debate like, you know, Solo's residual versus, you know, measured in terms of this, but there's a lot of different measures that get different things. So why limit tax competition? Okay. So this is sort of picking up on, so like sort of the famous sort of economist Gabriel Zuckerman, infamous, depending on your, you know, sort of talked about this from that perspective. But then a couple mates of mine write about this with a little more philosophical perspective, like Peter Deitch and others. Tax competition in this case, I mean the ability to move profits, paper wealth around the world, such as to avoid taxation. Right. That's what I mean by tax competition. I think that the ability to do that is one of limiting the ability to do that, including perhaps something like a universal global minimum tax, right, can be one way to address the way in which our tax reforms have made WTA worse. In the book,
Are you also thinking about it internally to America and tax competition between, you know, subnational governments and the national government?
you know, I actually don't have like a considered view on that. I mean, I could spout one off right now, but I probably should avoid that in this context because I'm being live streamed, who knows watching. But if it was just you all, I'd know that I could deny whatever I said later. But yeah. But the way I write about in the book is that, you know, as societies become increasingly WTA, our tax policy is, you know, one reasonable response for someone who's concerned with just work would be to adapt tax policy over time, right? So if the fruits of economic growth are being increasingly captured, you don't like that word, fine, captured by those at the top, one way to address that would be to adjust the tax code to do a number of other things, like to not have capital depreciation set up in such a way is that it makes it cheaper for people to invest in labor replacing technology than labor augmenting technology, if you like that line of work from Acemoglu and others, to not allow people to move paper profits around the world to avoid taxation, right? Or simply not to make it more regressive, right? I mean, even, sort of various Republicans like Orrin Cass, like Mitt Romney's domestic policy advisor says, we basically revise the tax code over time in order to shift the burden of taxation to work, and particularly workers, and companies then who employ their workers, providing a disincentive to do that. The phrase I use in the book is that the evolution of the American tax code throws gasoline on the fire of winner-take-all markets, right? Instead of addressing winner-take-all markets through the tax code, we've actually made them worse over and over again. And so here's some ways we might not have done that or do better.
Yeah, one way to achieve just work, and our thought process, you think about it. Now, in Europe, and a heart surgeon make about 1/3, 1/4 about what heart surgeon American makes, because the illusion of meritocracy, and so seems that to achieve the just work idea is to raise the basic salary. Now, and for heart surgeon, right, and the people who claim the surgical insurance, as important as a surgeon, in terms of value to the society, right? So they should pay a lot more.
Right, so surgeons should make more money?
Make less.
Oh, make less in the United States.
To decrease the gap between income inequality.
Yeah,
Because just like I say, people wash instruments, they contribute as much. Not in the
If I
magnitude.
put a point on this, basically, I take your point and just push it down, right? Why do we need a laundry list? You just need to pay people more.
Yeah, pay people more.
Just
Correct.
done.
Pay people more.
Well, your whole thing devolves down to pay people more.
Well, yeah, but then there's not like one person who does the paying that I can convince to pay people more, right? These are different policies. There's not like.
But in Europe they do, right? They income.
Yeah, oh, yeah, in health, yeah. I mean, there's
Yeah,
certain things
yeah,
that might be
they-
better run.
Beyond
Like a speedy
healthcare,
living
beyond,
country,
let's,
right?
let's not get
Not every. I don't think everything in the economy should have prices set by a central authority that then determines how much each people get paid. I think there's a wide range of
You
reasons.
do that in healthcare.
Wide range of reasons why that might be better in healthcare if you had a better system than healthcare, but it might not be something I don't think we should do for a whole society, right? So there's not one person who can pay people more, right? Part of most of these policies, right, and the reason why there's a lot, and the reason why they're there, and make it very clear, like, I'm not saying, like, in order to achieve just work, we need to adopt all of these policies, right? Sometimes they can counterindicated each other, right? These are different. Yeah, I know, right? But no, from a healthcare perspective, I think we agree. But just to talk more generally, or broadly agree, these are all things one might explore whose success at furthering just work doesn't depend on getting all the other things at the same time. They're all avenues, potential avenues for reform, right? So I'm not saying we should adopt all of them. I'm not saying, right? And with the why not pay people more, because there's no person paying people more. So a lot of these policies are structured such as a way to try and encourage, force, make it competition dependent upon paying people more. Yeah.
Why not have federal minimum wage on the list?
Why not have federal minimum wage on the list? Well, I think tight labor market takes care of a lot of that issues better than a minimum wage does, probably. But there are people who are smarter than me about that issue who disagree. But this is also not an exclusive list. So let me try and remember in the book. I think a lot of the arguments against minimum wage are often bad arguments, but I don't think raising the federal minimum wage will do that much for increasing middle class employment, as I understand it. It will do more at getting people across a certain minimum threshold, maybe. It might do more in terms of empowering workers in general. It might not. That's a controversial point that one would have to argue both ways. I'm not an opponent of a federal minimum wage. I'm not going to stake out a claim in for or against it, but I don't see it, I don't defend it as the heart of what one would need to do. And then what you would have to do with respect to minimum wage then is then, look through different things. But someone making $15 an hour, let's say that was the number, right, whatever. Let's say there was some disincentive in fact for raising that, and then some people might fall out. It still might be worth doing, right? Certainly not something you do in isolation. Disincentive to employment effects, in this case. But also, $15 an hour is probably not going to cut it for a middle class life, independent of anything else, right? So yeah, I mean, you could catch me 9 out of 10 days. I'd be in favor of something like a federal minimum wage, but I don't see it as the heart of the issue. Although it could be a symbolic political part of the process, I think, and that might be more important.
So I read your book at the same time as I read Asmanova's book, and her claim is essentially what matters is precariousness. rather than inequality. And I'm quite persuaded by this. In that you can take $15 an hour and make it $21 an hour, but if you're on a just-in-time contract with absolutely no security and you're a single mom, you can give them 30, life still sucks. So it's about the lack of control and the distribution of power and authority, which isn't reducible just to a question of relative incomes. So how would you think about a Smithian well-ordered society and precariousness? Because the technologies that have allowed precariety to happen, along with the shift in power, is something that Smith never had to contend with.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, so you may recall, it's been a while since you've read the book too, but
No, I read it this week.
you read it again this week? Boy, I wish I had read it this week. That would have been a lot better. but okay, there we go. Mark read it in advance. He gave a blurb for it.
I did, and then I read it again this week.
But in any event, there's some insecurity is an important. It's a nice help question too. Like insecurity is an important part of way of thinking about middle class life. And in fact, if you look at now, there's some problems with some of this data. So there was, various words of talking about the American dream, particularly if there's literature that comes from post-Great Financial Crisis. You had a huge percentage of people in the United States saying that economic security meant more to them than the ability than like a fair race. What they really cared about was having enough, having a certain quality of life, and having that be reasonably secure so they could count on it, right? And that their kids would have a better chance, right? So security might be more important, right? And fair race doesn't do anything about the security issue at all, right? It simply says, like, look, 80% of the population can be living day to day, week to week, completely beholden to their employers, dominated, dependent upon their whim and will for their success or failure, can be fired like this and then not have enough of there not being a tight enough labor market for them to push back on their employers, right? And they still might have gotten there through their own choices, right? So just work is going to say there's something fundamentally not right about that, even if you get fair race right, right? Even if you get it to the case that like everybody had a fair shot and some people just won this game, like 10% of the people just won this game, right? And so they get these yachts and they get to do whatever and they get to try over and they have these little, tiny little dishes that they like that are super expensive and whatever, have the best cocaine and whatever. Like these small amount of people won this game, it's still not good, right? Without just work, because what most people care about is not having the chance to become the best, but what they care about is these other things, right? So a fair race society one that's just from a fair race perspective, right, would not be one that would address fundamentally what people care about. But more than that, I do think it would self-defeating too. Again, once you have an economics of WTA, you're going to engender opportunity hoarding sort of by definition, and all the other various aspects, right? So you're not going to be able to maintain a fair race society over time. You can do it as a theoretical construct, but I don't see the politics over time of a society that singularly focused on fair race and getting at these sorts of issues. Hope that helps to answer your question and get it together. Minimum wage, again, very few proponents of a federal minimum wage understand a federal minimum wage to be the only policy they'd like to see happen. They want to see it part of a basket of other things. Is it a step forward? I would be inclined in most contexts to say yes, but I don't highlight it, in part because I don't have anything new or interesting to say about it. Yeah.
There seems to be one missing part in your discussion. That's the impact of globalization.
Yeah.
Talk about, and a lot, what affected the just work, in the United States is partly because of globalization, right? That's what the Donald Trump supported become. No. So I didn't see you talk about.
Well, I didn't talk about it in the presentation, but yeah, I mean, so chapter 1 of the book, it describes a variety of different trends that are making societies winner take all, and one of them would be, one of the sort of archetypal, David mentioned Frank's work, right? So, and Cook's work, so one of the sort of drivers of that is technological change combined with or enabling globalization. So it's legal changes made it more possible, and technological changes made it more possible. And as David points out, lots of reasons to like some of the things that came about from those changes. But yeah, so globalization, it's a word that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But yeah, yeah.
Well, unfortunately, globalization is really a liberal progressive, a construct.
Okay, let's take this a bit far away. We have to get the time. Does anyone else want to have the last question?
Can I-
Go ahead.
Yeah,
Thank you.
please.
Hi.
I was just wondering if either your methodology or your conceptualization of justice and just work helps us sort of adjudicate what of all of these potential legislations are more important or more pressing. I'm not sure what language you would use. There's a way to sort of adjudicate between that, and also how you see your concept sort of relating to freedom, particularly like Republican notions of freedom. That's kind of what I'm hearing. It sounds like freedom from domination is potentially a way you're sort of thinking about it.
I don't talk as much about that. So like, I just, you didn't ask for biography, and now I'm going to answer with biography. But two different spheres of my research. One is on ethics and economics of global value chains. Another is on finance and financial reform. And both of these take a Republican influenced and/or, depending on the paper or book, a distinctly Republican approach to freedom in these things, right? And in the book, I didn't do as much with that. There's some, and I don't even know if it came up on this chart, actually. I mean, I talk about different ways of encouraging different forms of collective bargaining and other things of power. In part, given the nature of the book, in part, given the nature of the book, I only focus so much on certain sorts of things. But I think fundamental to what people care about, I write, there is a quote in the book. It says, concern with domination is American as apple pie, right? And this is a fundamental concern that people have. And so I guess the best way to answer your question is that just work definitely has part of what has a relational component is to say that people care about whether or not they have control or say over their life. But I don't define just work in terms of that control or that power. And I don't do something like, say, Pettit in earlier work with saying that something like Republican freedom is the one fundamental principle with which we should assess policy. My work doesn't work that way methodologically, right? But I think these are fundamental concerns that need to, as I argue, be part of a cost-benefit analysis of financial reform, ought to be how we think about how to govern global value chains, but also ought to be part of what it would mean to relate to each other as equal, in other words, a just work society. I don't really have a tool for, I don't have one possible way I could go, and then I'll stop here, Mark, because I know it's time. One possible way to extend this then would be to come up with a semi-formal way of talking about just work that you could then use to measure different policies against each other. I'm not sure if there would be value in that or not, but that is one thing I've considered. And then you could say, like, okay, what's the best bang for our buck politically here? What should we go for first, or something like that? A possible way to explore. I'm not 100% sure how that would go, but it doesn't provide a chief lens of proportion. This list, the reason why it's there, it's meant to be ecumenical, but it's meant to, fundamentally what I'm saying is, look, these are some things, but what we need to do is, whenever we're having conversations about policy in general, we need to put the distributive impacts of those policy debates front and center, and we need to think about the distributive impacts not just in terms of wealth or income inequality, but instead in terms of these other values that are captured in just work. And if we have that lens, we're going to do better than if we don't. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.